All right, how's it going, everybody? So we're going to read the military program of the Proletarian Revolution, Part 3 by Lenin. He wrote it in 1916, wrote it during, as the what we call World War I had been continuing on, the imperialist war of the quote, great powers, is what it was kind of referred to as then, or what Lenin refers to it as, the imperialist war of the, fighting between imperialist countries, So let's go ahead. And if there's one thing here in the United States that we have, it's that our country is definitely, it survives off imperialism. Our entire economy has been built off imperialism and off the exploitation of workers in other countries. And it only results in exploitation of the working class here. But there is, maybe a bourgeois and ever shrinking petty bourgeois class of people here that remain healthy and stay kind of keep a monopoly on everything. They keep that healthy through imperialism, or else there would not be enough material to do that. But because of this, also, there's no empathy for the amount of people in the United States who are in prison, which is the most incarcerated country on the earth. All of this is imperialist economy. Every single bit of it relies on the commune between the liberal bourgeoisie, the capitalist bourgeoisie. We're in the capitalist government. Instead of our social government, our socialist government. Instead of a socialist government, we have no socialist government. The liberal bourgeoisie and the capitalist government are basically work together in commune to gain more and more profit, take more and more material, and that results in what we have today. So this is why it's important to understand, is because, Lenin was writing to Europeans when he wrote this kind of stuff. He wrote to, who at that time were living in imperialist governments, He kind of lived in Russia, which Russia, had been the Tsarist empire for like 400 years at that point. But was also, he looked at the international bourgeoisie that dictated Russia, like it dictated these other, and that's kind of in contrast to say like the United Kingdom, who had an empire that would be all over, from Africa to America to Australia to Asia, Russia had a 400 year long Tsarist empire, so this is why this stuff is Lenin also particularly wrote a lot. So I'm gonna go ahead and get into this. Let's read the third part of the military program of the Proletarian Revolution. So let's go ahead and get into this. So part 3. The disarmament advocates object to the quote armed nation end quote clause in the program. Also because it more easily leads, they allege, to concessions to opportunism. The cardinal point, namely, the relation of disarmament to the class struggle and to the social revolution, we have examined above. We shall now examine the relation between the disarmament demand and opportunism. One of the chief reasons why it is unacceptable is precisely that together with the illusions it creates, it inevitably weakens and devitalizes our struggle against opportunism. Undoubtedly, this struggle is the main immediate question, now confusing the international struggle against imperialism that is not closely linked with the struggle against opportunism is either an empty phrase or a fraud. One of the main defects of Zimmerwald and Kienthal on the main reasons why these embryos of the Third International may possibly end in a fiasco is that the question of fighting opportunism was not even raised openly, let alone solved in the sense of proclaiming the need to break with the opportunists. Opportunism has triumphed temporarily in the European labor movement. Its two main shades are apparent in all the big countries. First, the avowed, cynical, and therefore less dangerous social imperialism of Messrs. Plekhanov, Scheidemann, Legion, Albert Thomas, and Simbat, Vandervelde, Heinemann, Henderson, etc. Second, the concealed Kautskyite opportunism. Kautsky, Heiss, the Social Democratic Labor Group in Germany, Longuet, Presmain, Mayeres et al. In France, Ramsay MacDonald and the other leaders of the Independent Labour Party in England, Martov, in England, Martov, I don't know how to say this name, it's Chkheidzee, etc. In Russia, Treves and the other so-called left reformists in Italy. Avowed opportunism is openly and directly opposed to revolution and to incipient revolutionary movements and outbursts. It is in direct alliance with the governments, varied as the forms of this alliance may be, from accepting ministerial posts and participation and the war industries committees in Russia. The mass opportunists, the Kalskyites, are much more harmful and dangerous to the labor movement because they hide their advocacy of alliance with the former under a cloak of plausible pseudo-quote Marxist catchwords and pacifist slogans. The fight against both these forms of prevailing opportunism must be conducted in all fields of proletarian politics, parliament, the trade unions, strikes, the armed forces, etc. The main distinguishing feature of both these forms of prevailing opportunism is the concrete question of the connection between the present war and revolution, and the other concrete questions of revolution and the other concrete questions of revolution. Are hushed up, concealed or treated with an eye to police prohibitions. And this despite the fact that before the war, the connection between this impending war and the proletarian revolution was emphasized innumerable times, both unofficially and officially, in the Basel Manifesto. The main defect of the disarmament demand is its evasion of all the concrete questions of revolution. Or do the advocates of disarmament stand for an altogether new kind of revolution, unarmed revolution? To proceed, we are by no means opposed to the fight for reforms, and we do not wish to ignore the sad possibility, the worst comes to the worst, of mankind going through a second imperialist war, if revolution does not come out of the present war in spite of our efforts. We favor a program of reforms directed also against the opportunists. They would be only too glad if we left the struggle for reforms entirely to them and sought escape from sad reality and nebulous, quote, disarmament fantasy. Disarmament means simply running away from unpleasant reality, not fighting it. In such a program, we should say something like this. Quote, to accept the defense of the fatherland slogan in the 1914 through 16 imperialist war is to corrupt the labor movement with the aid of a bourgeois lie. Such a concrete reply to a concrete question would be more correct theoretically, much more useful to the proletariat, and more unbearable to the opportunist than the disarmament demand and repudiation of, quote, all and any, end quote, defense of the fatherland. And we would add, quote, the bourgeoisie of all the imperialists, great powers, England, France, Germany, Austria, Russia, Japan, the United States, has become so reactionary and so intent on world domination that any war waged by the bourgeoisie of those countries is bound to be reactionary. The proletariat must not only oppose all such wars, but must also wish for the defeat of its own government in such wars, and utilize its defeat for revolutionary insurrection, if an insurrection to prevent the war proves unsuccessful. End quote. On the question of a militia, we should say, we are not in favor of a bourgeois militia. We are in favor only of a proletarian militia. Therefore, not a penny, not a man. Not only for a standing army, but even for a bourgeois militia, even in countries like the United States or Switzerland, Norway, etc. The more so that in the freest republican countries, e.g. Switzerland, we see the militia is being increasingly Prussianized, particularly in 1907 and 1911, and prostituted by being used against strikers. We can demand popular election of officers, abolition of all military law, equal rights for foreign and native-born workers, a point particularly important for those imperialist states which, like Switzerland, are more and more blatantly exploiting larger numbers of foreign workers, while denying them all rights. Further, we can demand the right of every 100, say, inhabitants of a given country to form voluntary military training associations, with free election of instructors paid by the state, etc. Only under these conditions could the proletariat acquire military training for itself and not for its slave owners, and the need for such training is imperatively dictated by the interests of the proletariat. The Russian Revolution showed that every success of the revolutionary movement, even a partial success like the seizure of a certain city, a certain factory town, or winning over a certain section of the army, inevitably compels the victorious proletariat to carry out just such a program. Lastly, it stands to reason that opportunism can never be defeated by mere programs. It can only be defeated by deeds. The greatest and fatal error of the bankrupt Second International was that its words did not correspond to its deeds, that it cultivated the habit of hypocritical and unscrupulous revolutionary phrase-mongering. Note the present attitude of Kautsky and Company towards the Basel Manifesto. Disarmament as a social idea. i.e., an idea that springs from and can affect a certain social environment and is not the invention of some crackpot, springs, evidently, from the peculiar, quote, tranquil, end quote, conditions prevailing by way of exception in certain small states, which have for a fairly long time stood aside from the world's path of war and bloodshed and hope to remain in that way. To be convinced of this, we have only to consider the arguments advanced, for instance, by the Norwegian advocates of disarmament. Quote, we are a small country, end quote. They say, quote, our army is small. There is nothing we could do against the great powers, and consequently, nothing we could do to resist forcible involvement in an imperialist alliance with one or the other great power group. We want to be left in peace in our backwoods and continue our backwoods politics, disband disarmament, compulsory arbitration, permanent neutrality, etc. Quote, permanent after the Belgian fashion, no doubt. The petty striving of petty states to hold aloof the petty bourgeois desire to keep as far away as possible from the great battles of world history, to take advantage of one's relatively monopolistic position in order to remain in hidebound passivity. This is the objective social environment, which may ensure the disarmament idea of a certain degree of success and a certain degree of popularity in some small states. That striving is, of course, reactionary and is based entirely on illusions, for, in one way or another, imperialism draws the small states into the vortex of world economy and world politics. In Switzerland, for instance, the imperialist environment objectively prescribes two courses to the labor movement. The opportunists in alliance with the bourgeoisie are seeking to turn the country into a Republican democratic monopolistic federation that would thrive on profits from imperialist bourgeois tourists and to make this, quote, tranquil, end quote, monopolistic position as profitable and tranquil as possible. The genuine Swiss social democrats are striving to use Switzerland's relative freedom and her, quote, international position to help the victory of the close alliance of the revolutionary elements and the European workers' parties. Switzerland, thank God, does not have a separate language of her own, but uses three world languages, the three languages spoken in the adjacent belligerent countries. If 20,000 Swiss party members were to pay a weekly levy of 2 centimes as a sort of extra war tax, we would have 20,000 francs per annum, a sum more than sufficient periodically to publish in 3 languages and distribute among the workers and soldiers of the belligerent countries, in spite of the bans imposed by the general staffs. All the truthful evidence about the incipient revolt of the workers, their fraternizing in the trenches, their hope that the weapons will be used for revolutionary struggle against the imperialist bourgeoisie of their own countries, etc. That is not new. It is being done by the best papers like La Sentinelle, Volksrecht, and the Berner Tagwacht, although unfortunately on an inadequate scale. Only through such activity can the splendid decision of the Aarau Party Congress become something more than merely a splendid decision. The question that interests us now is, does the disarmament demand correspond to this revolutionary trend among the Swiss Social Democrats? It obviously does not. Objectively, disarmament is an extremely national, a specifically national program of small states. It is certainly not the international program of international revolutionary social democracy. Okay. So yeah, that is the third and the final part of the military program of the Proletarian Revolution. So yeah, thank y'all for tuning in. This is Marxist Side. Y'all can follow me Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, TikTok, Tumblr, and Medium. Follow me there. Hit me up. Feel free to reach out to me. Y'all have a great day, and Todara Goi.